You're listening to Puma Podcast.
I do know that there are cases of cyanide fishing before, even here in the Philippines. But I think the reason that it has become more alarming is that it has become more prevalent.
Sabi po ni Secretary Malaya, parang they are intent to file a case against China.
If we feel that there is enough ground to do so, we will.
The Philippines is investigating reports that China is using cyanide to fish in our waters. The reports from Filipino fisherfolk once again highlight the many illegal maritime activities that put them and the rest of the country at risk. But illegal unreported and unregulated fishing, or IUU, is a catch-all term that does little to communicate just how harmful and wide-reaching its effects are.
I think it's really important to understand that IUU is an intersectional issue. And what does that mean? I mean, it occurs at the intersection of environment, economic, and social well-being. It's a multifaceted issue that touches upon many aspects of global security and cooperation.
In this episode, an expert walks us through this boundary-transcending crisis and tells us what we can do to address it. I'm Bella Perez Rubio, Puma Podcast, and you're listening to Teka Teka News.
It's estimated that 23 billion US dollars a year are stolen from the global economy.
That's maritime security analyst Annie Barlow speaking at a forum hosted by the Daniel K. Inouye Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies. Her research on illegal fishing practices focuses mainly on our corner of the world, Southeast Asia.
That undermines the economic viability of legal fisheries. It also stirs up economic losses in developing countries, coastal states, and legitimate fishing communities. Yeah. In the Indo-Pacific region, many of those countries get a large portion of their GDP from fish, from seafood. In Southeast Asia alone, 200 million people are dependent on healthy fisheries for their livelihoods and their income. If we don't have healthy fisheries, what are these people going to do? Where are they going to go?
And as you heard her mention at the top of this episode, this issue is even more complex than it seems. Barlow calls it a transboundary crisis, which means that it transcends both geographical and policy boundaries. That makes it both hard to track and to solve.
There are 200 million people that are dependent on a resource that we are losing. And so they still need to feed their families. They still need to put food on their plates. And this creates a situation where they are vulnerable and targets to transnational organized crime, migration issues, other criminal activities, and all-out lawlessness.
Here's a more concrete walkthrough of just how dynamic this crisis can be.
If you're engaged in illegal fishing, you are not paying your workers. You are probably involved in some kind of document forgery, tax evasion, other white-collar crimes. You're laundering money. And when you're involved in so many different crimes and you need so many different people to work with, this starts to build a network of organized crime. And it does go internationally, and so we call it transnational organized crime. And illegal fishing does provide a covert, kind of opaque area in which to traffic humans from it. We spoke earlier briefly about labor abuse and exploitation having large spectrum. And we talked about forced labor and modern day slavery being more part of the egregious part of the spectrum. But it's also, some of that constitutes human trafficking. The opaque operations of fishing vessels traveling between borders with almost impunity also creates a great way to traffic humans that aren't working on the boat, but that you would use for other things. And also trafficking drugs, small arms, all of this is helping other transnational organized crime networks and terrorist operations.
There's a human cost to illegal fishing that often goes overlooked. It's a cost plenty of seafaring Filipinos know too well. More on that after a quick break.
Oftentimes, Fishers, migrant laborers are lured into the promise of decent wages and stable work, only to find themselves in this nightmarish reality of forced labor and abuse. They are forced to work long, grueling hours in hazardous conditions, oftentimes with little to no rest, at least not adequate rest, and oftentimes with little to no compensation. Many endure physical, mental, and sometimes sexual abuse, have deprivation of food, clean water, basic health and safety measures. They are constricted on the vessels, not allowed to move.
By the International Labor Organization's count, over 4,000 Filipinos leave the country each year to fish on foreign vessels. The abuse they suffer in exchange for low pay is widely and frequently reported. And as Barlow says, this crisis goes beyond borders. Fishers from other parts of the region share in this experience.
One particular story that does stick out in my mind is the story of Sobriyanet. He was an Indonesian fisherman, and he did a stint in distant water fleets that had been really profitable for him and his family. He came home and decided that he wanted to go back on another fishing exploration to bring home more money for his family. And so he registered with an Indonesian recruitment agency who found him a job with a Taiwanese long-lining vessel. And he was contracted at $350 a month, which sounds not like much maybe to Western countries, but for these fishermen, it's a good opportunity. And almost right away on the vessel, he found out that he was actually going to have a deduction of $100 a month from the company until he finished his 2-year contract. And that really was to deter the fishermen from running away, right? Well, they also mounted him with fees and fines in those first couple of months. So in the first 2 months of working, he only made a total of $100 $700 down to $1. Well, photographic and video evidence showed us later the amount of physical abuse he endured on the vessel at the hands of the captain, but also at the hands of his fellow crew who are ordered to do so by the captain. And even if they don't want to, they have to because they're scared of retribution. They're scared for their family safety on land. So he was beat for 4 months and tragically sustained the types of injuries that ended his life a mere 4 months after getting to that vessel. Those deductions from his wages for not finishing his contract, they never made it to his bank account. His family never saw those promised wages. And now he's unable to provide for his family or for the community. Forced labor really doesn't affect only the individual experiencing the violence. It's a cycle, and it impacts family, and it introduces trauma to the communities. When your wages are withheld and your freedom is confined, you're unable to support your loved ones, and you're unable to contribute to a developing economy of your community back home. There's no justice for fishers. No. There's no justice for the family. There's no justice for the community. And in the end, this cycle continues to wreak havoc on the poorest communities and the most vulnerable populations. The question really becomes, how do we, as an international community, affect change in this transboundary crisis? What can we do? My research shows that it requires an integrated deterrent approach. Okay. When we think about what this looks like in reality, it is talking to each other, it is learning, it is collaborating, it is forming a strategic response.
For countries in the Indo-Pacific, that means working to universally adopt and implement measures that are already in place.
Well, let's take the Port State Measures Agreement for an example. Most countries in Southeast Asia have signed on to the Port State Measures Agreement. And how the PSMA works is it introduces port control measures in at port, meaning when a foreign flagged vessel comes into port to offload their fish, they can't offload their fish, they can't sell their fish, they can't have access to the market until an investigator goes on board and can verify that these fish were all caught legally and without the use of forced labor. Well, the problem comes when you have a state like Malaysia that has not signed or ratified the Port State Measures Agreement. Now, all of a sudden, there's a loophole. Now, those practicing illegal fishing techniques can bring their fish into Malaysia and offload them there, which really undermines the power of the PSMA as an international instrument.
Even countries like the US, the Marcos Jr. administration's closest ally in upholding our maritime rights, can do more. And that's coming from an American analyst.
We have a responsibility as a global leader
Yes.
to work on maritime security issues and challenges. And yet, we have not become a party to UNCLOS. We've signed it, we operate under its framework, but we haven't ratified it. And I think it's something that definitely deserves a little bit of attention, because if we're going to be true global leaders, we need to start with ourselves. And uniform adoption and implementation of these measures is necessary.
But as Barlow says, everyone has a role to play, and some Filipino communities have taken up the mantle.
In the Philippines, they have this program called Bantay Dagat, which empowers local communities to be the eyes and ears and enforcement on the water to look for illegal fishers.
Bantay Dagat is a practice that has been deployed by Filipino civilians to guard our coastal waters since at least the 1970s. It was formalized as a civilians fisheries patrol force by Senator Santanina Razul in the 90s. It now works with several government agencies.
My favorite story is of a community deep in the Sulu archipelago, and they've been very successful in making apprehensions of illegal fishers. The fishermen themselves are becoming the enforcement agencies. So besides protecting their resource and empowering them, they're also learning the laws around fisheries, why those are laws, and they're able to be stewards of their own area, and they're able to have power. And this is critical if we want them to feel empowered, if we want them to raise their voice and to be proud to raise their voice.
And that was today's episode of Teka Teka News. Again, I'm Bella Perez Rubio. Pidoy Blanco edited this episode. Our executive producer is Jill Caro, and our senior news editor is Veronica Uy. If you found this episode useful, share it with a friend or two, and thanks for listening.